When I first moved into the old brick apartment complex on the corner of Maple and Pine, I didn't expect much. It wasn't glamorous, and the paint on the stairwell was chipped, but it was affordable for a broke college student trying to juggle tuition, part-time jobs, and the endless list of expenses that adulthood seemed to throw at me. My new apartment was small, just a single bedroom with creaky wooden floors and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. But to me, it represented freedom. On my first morning there, lugging a box of books up the stairs, I noticed him. He was my downstairs neighbor, an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with silver hair, weathered hands, and a quiet way about him. He was dressed neatly, even though it was early, wearing a pressed button-down shirt tucked into dark slacks. He was locking his door as I passed by, and for a moment, our eyes met. "Morning," he said simply, with a polite nod. I gave him a quick smile in return, slightly startled by his deep, calm voice. "Good morning." And that was it. No lingering conversation, no small talk about the weather, just a polite acknowledgement, and then he was gone, heading down the hallway with measured steps, like someone who valued routine. Over the next few days, I noticed him more often. He didn't seem like the other tenants, the ones who rushed out with their coffee, spilling over paper cups, or came home late blasting music. He moved at a slower pace, unhurried, almost deliberate. There was something about his presence that made the whole building feel quieter when he was around. At first, I didn't think much of it. To me, he was just the older neighbor. We exchanged the occasional nod when we crossed paths in the hallway, but we never spoke beyond that. He wasn't unfriendly, just reserved, like someone who had learned to keep his world small and private. But even in those brief encounters, I couldn't help but notice the details. The way his shoes were always polished, even though no one seemed to notice. The faint scent of coffee that clung to him when he walked past. The fact that, while others in the building carried grocery bags filled with snacks and frozen meals, his were neatly packed with fresh vegetables, bread from the bakery down the street, and sometimes a bundle of flowers wrapped in brown paper. There was something intriguing about him, not in a romantic sense at first, but in the way you notice someone who doesn't quite fit the mold. He wasn't invisible, but he wasn't trying to be noticed either. He was just different. I often wondered what his story was. Why a man his age lived alone in a modest apartment instead of a house with a family. Why he seemed so comfortable in solitude. Why, despite the lines on his face and the gray in his hair, there was a kind of quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. At 20, I felt like I was running a constant race, chasing deadlines, friendships, dreams, and independence. And then there was him, 58, moving at a rhythm completely opposite mine. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. Yet, somehow, the thin walls of that apartment complex brought us side by side, two lives brushing against each other without either of us realizing that soon, those small moments would grow into something much bigger, something neither of us could have predicted. It was around my second week in the apartment when I first noticed his routine. I had been up late studying for an exam, and, for once, managed to wake up before sunrise. My window faced the courtyard, and when I pushed aside the curtain, I saw him outside. There he was, my 58-year-old neighbor, standing in the early morning light, a watering can in one hand, a small metal tray in the other. The courtyard itself wasn't much to look at, a patch of grass, a few bushes, and some cement walkways, but he seemed to treat it like a sacred space. Slowly, with deliberate care, he poured water over a cluster of flowers planted near the fence. Then, bending down with practiced ease, he set out a few bowls of milk and scraps of food. Within minutes, two stray cats padded over, rubbing against his ankles as though he belonged to them. I found myself leaning closer to the glass, curious. Who wakes up at sunrise just to feed strays and tend to flowers in an apartment courtyard that most tenants ignored? The next morning, I looked again, and sure enough, he was there. Same pressed shirt, though sometimes he wore a cardigan over it. Same quiet patience in the way he moved. This time, I noticed something else. He hummed as he worked. It wasn't loud, just a faint tune that carried on the morning air, soft and steady, like an old song that only he remembered. By the third morning, it became clear that this wasn't a random act. It was a ritual. Every single day, he was outside at sunrise, watering, feeding, humming. His movements were so consistent it felt as though the entire courtyard relied on him to come alive. Without him, it would have been just a neglected patch of green. With him, it seemed cared for, almost loved. I started to wonder why I was so drawn to it. Maybe it was because, at 20, my mornings were chaotic. Alarms snoozed 3 times, rushing to classes, coffee spilled on my notes. My life felt scattered, uncertain, but watching him gave me a strange sense of calm. He wasn't rushing to get anywhere. He wasn't stressing over being late. He was simply present. After a while, it became my routine too. I would wake earlier than I needed to, just so I could peek out my window and see what he was doing that day. Sometimes, he would be trimming the plants. Other times, setting out breadcrumbs for the birds. On weekends, he brought out a folding chair, sat with a steaming cup of coffee, and read a newspaper while the cats lounged at his feet. I didn't know why it fascinated me so much. Maybe because it was so different from the restless energy of youth. Maybe because it reminded me that life didn't have to be lived at full speed all the time. Or maybe because there was something quietly mysterious about him, about the way he seemed content in a world that constantly demanded more. I never thought he'd notice me watching. But one morning, he looked up from the flowers and met my eyes, and instead of looking away quickly, he smiled, a small, knowing smile, before lifting a flower from the soil, brushing it clean, and holding it in his hand like he meant to give it to someone. That was the morning I realized this. Routine wasn't just his anymore. Somehow, it was becoming mine to. The first time we actually spoke, beyond the polite good morning exchanged in the hallway, happened on one of those quiet sunrise mornings. I had woken earlier than usual, pulled by curiosity, and instead of just peeking through my window, I stepped outside with a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet grass from last night's rain. He was there, of course, crouched by the flower bed, his hands brushing soil away from a cluster of daisies. The strays circled around him, meowing softly, impatient for their breakfast. I hesitated, unsure if I should disturb him. He seemed so absorbed in his ritual that speaking felt like interrupting a prayer. But before I could turn back inside, he glanced up. "You're up early," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. I laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Coffee helps." He nodded, standing slowly, and for the first time, I noticed how tall he was. Not imposing, but steady, like a tree that had weathered storms. He wiped his hands on a cloth tucked in his pocket, then looked at me with a faint, unreadable smile. "You usually watch from your window," he added like it was something he had long known. Heat rushed to my cheeks. "Oh, I wasn't spying. I just noticed you're always out here. I guess it's nice to see someone who actually takes care of this place." Instead of being offended, he chuckled softly. "I don't mind. Most people don't notice at all." Then, without hesitation, he bent down and plucked one of the daisies, brushing off the dirt clinging to its stem. He walked over and held it out to me. "For you," he said simply. I froze for a moment, staring at the small white flower in his hand. No one had ever given me something so simple, yet so intentional. I took it, my fingers brushing his rough, calloused ones. "Thank you," I said quietly. He gestured to the porch steps near the courtyard. "Sit." I was just about to make coffee. I hesitated again but followed him. A few minutes later, he handed me a chipped ceramic mug filled with steaming, freshly brewed coffee that smelled much richer than the cheap instant powder I usually drank. We sat in silence at first, the sound of birds filling the gap. Finally, I asked, "Why do you do it?" "The watering, the cats, the flowers." He looked out toward the small patch of garden, his expression thoughtful. "Because mornings are the only time the world feels quiet, and because it gives me something to care for." There was something in his tone, a heaviness hidden beneath the calm, that made me curious, but I didn't press. Instead, I found myself admitting, "I don't know what I'm doing with my life most days. Everyone else seems so sure, but I just feel lost." He turned to me then, his gaze steady but kind. "That feeling doesn't disappear with age. The difference is, eventually you learn that not knowing is part of the journey." The mornings help remind me of that. For a long time, we just sat there, sipping coffee, sharing the silence like it was something valuable. It wasn't just a neighborly chat, it was the start of something neither of us could name yet. And as I looked at the daisy resting in my lap, I knew this wasn't going to be the last morning we spent together. After that first real conversation, the mornings felt different. They weren't just his anymore, or mine in secret, they became ours. I started to wake up earlier, not out of obligation but out of anticipation. By the time I stepped outside, with my mug of coffee, he was already there, either feeding the cats or trimming the plants, and he'd always glance up with that quiet smile that said, "I was expecting you." What surprised me most was how easily we talked. At first, the conversations were light: books, the weather, my classes, his favorite meals to cook. But soon, they began to stretch into deeper waters. He told me about his travels when he was younger, how he had once wanted to be a painter but had settled into a steady office career instead. I confessed my fears about choosing the wrong path in college, about how I didn't know who I was supposed to become. "You don't have to know yet," he told me one morning, sipping his coffee, slowly, like each sip deserved respect. "The pressure to have it all figured out by 20 is just noise. Life doesn't unfold on anyone's schedule but your own." His words stayed with me. It was strange, my friends, professors, even my family, often gave advice that felt heavy, almost suffocating. But when he spoke, it felt like he was lifting a weight off my shoulders instead of adding to it. The little things became our unspoken rituals. He would bring an extra mug for me, filling it with his rich, dark roast that put my instant coffee to shame. I started bringing him pastries from the corner bakery, laughing when he pretended to scold me for ruining breakfast with sugar. We sat on those porch steps like old friends, even though we were separated by nearly 4 decades of life. But what struck me most wasn't just his wisdom, it was the way he listened. Truly listened. When I talked, he didn't interrupt, didn't glance at his phone or check the time. His attention was steady, grounded, like he believed every word I said mattered. In a world where so much of my voice felt drowned out, his presence gave it weight. One morning, as the sun cast a soft gold across the courtyard, I caught myself noticing details I hadn't before: the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, that deepened when he smiled, the calm strength in his hands as he poured water over the flowers, the steadiness in his posture. There was nothing flashy or loud about him, yet there was something magnetic in his simplicity. I wasn't sure what to make of that feeling. Was it admiration, affection, a strange mix of both? Whatever it was, I couldn't deny that each morning, I left our conversations lighter than I'd felt in years. For him, I think, it was different too. One morning, he admitted, "It's been a long time since I had someone to share these hours with." His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. "The mornings used to be quiet, but now they feel alive again." Something unspoken hung between us after that. Not love, not yet, but a closeness that went beyond friendship. A connection that surprised us both, bridging a gap neither of us had expected to cross. And as the days passed, I began to realize that these mornings weren't just shaping my routine, they were shaping me. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the world felt softer, hushed by the absence of weekday noise. I came downstairs expecting the usual: coffee, stray cats, quiet conversation. But instead of waiting on the porch, he was standing near the far end of the courtyard, his back to me, holding a small pair of gardening shears. Curious, I walked toward him, the grass still damp beneath my shoes. That's when I noticed it. Tucked behind the ordinary flower beds he tended so carefully was a hidden corner of the garden I had never seen before. A narrow arch of climbing vines half concealed the entrance, and beyond it, sunlight spilled across, a secluded patch bursting with color: roses, tulips, lilies, a breathtaking mix of flowers arranged with almost reverent care. It was nothing like the modest beds near the walkway. This was intentional, personal, a place touched by memory. He didn't hear me approach until I spoke. "I didn't know this was here," I said softly, afraid to disturb the sacredness of it. He turned, startled at first, then relaxed when he saw me. "Most people don't," he admitted. "I suppose I've kept it hidden on purpose." I stepped closer, the fragrance of the blooms wrapping around me. "It's beautiful." For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the flowers, his expression unreadable, until finally he said, "This was my wife's garden." The words fell into the air like something heavy but inevitable. He crouched down, brushing a petal with the gentleness of someone handling fragile glass. "She loved flowers more than anything. When we moved here, she said she couldn't live without them, so we planted this together. Every morning, she'd sit here with her tea and talk to me about which ones were blooming. It was our place." I didn't interrupt, sensing the weight of his memory. His voice carried both warmth and sorrow, as if every flower was a thread pulling him back to her. She passed away 10 years ago, he continued quietly. Cancer. After that, I couldn't bring myself to sit here. For a long time, I let the garden fade. But one day I realized letting it die felt like letting her go twice, so I brought it back. It's how I remember her, how I keep her with me. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Suddenly, his rituals, the early mornings, the care with which he nurtured the courtyard, the steadiness of his routines, all made sense. It wasn't just about flowers or stray cats. It was about holding on to something that had once defined his world. Looking at him, I felt something shift inside me. This man who seemed so composed, so steady, carried grief like a shadow stitched to his every step. And yet, instead of letting it harden him, he had turned it into tenderness. "I'm glad you showed me," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes tired but kind. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in how you look, but in the way you listen." She always listened. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to me. In that moment, the space between us felt charged, not romantic, not platonic, but something deeper, something human. That morning changed everything. From then on, I didn't just see him as the quiet neighbor with a routine. I saw him as a man carrying both love and loss, choosing every day to honor the past while still finding meaning in the present. And somehow, I had become a part of that present. That the morning of my 20th birthday, I woke up earlier than usual. Maybe it was excitement, maybe it was just habit. Now, my body had grown used to rising with the sun, eager to step into the courtyard where he would already be waiting. But that morning felt different, though I couldn't yet say why. When I stepped outside, I expected to see him kneeling by the flowers or feeding the cats. Instead, he was standing by the porch table, waiting for me with a small smile. The table, usually bare, except for 2 mugs, was now set with care. A plate of warm croissants from the bakery down the street, to steaming cups of coffee, and in the center, a tiny glass jar holding a single daisy. For a moment, I just stood there, caught off guard. "What's all this?" I asked, blinking at the sight. He gestured for me to sit. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" I froze. I hadn't told him. I hadn't mentioned it at all. "How did you?" He chuckled softly. "The mailman delivered a card to your box yesterday by mistake. I didn't open it, of course, but the envelope had balloons printed all over it. I put 2 and 2 together." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're impossible. And you're 20, he said with gentle finality, sliding the plate toward me. "That deserves at least breakfast." I sat down, touched in a way I couldn't fully explain. No one else had planned anything for me yet. My friends were busy, my family lived miles away, and I had told myself it didn't matter. But here he was, this man nearly 40 years older than me, remembering and making the effort in a way no one else had. As we ate, the sun rose higher, casting a golden light across the courtyard. For once, I wasn't rushing off anywhere. I just let the moment sink in. The warmth of the coffee in my hands, the quiet presence of someone who cared enough to notice, the faint hum of his voice as he wished me a happy birthday again. After a pause, he said something that stayed with me long. Birthdays stop being about gifts after a while. They become about perspective, about who you're becoming, and who you have beside you as you grow. I hope you carry both carefully." His words hit me deeper than I expected. At 20, I had been so caught up in chasing the future that I rarely thought about the present. Sitting there with him, I realized how much these mornings had given me. Not just calm, but clarity, grounding, and a reminder that connection could be found in the most unexpected places. I reached across the table, touching the daisy in the jar lightly. "This is the best birthday I've had in a long time," I admitted. He didn't say much in response, just smiled in that quiet, knowing way of his. But I could see it in his eyes, the same unspoken gratitude I felt. We had stumbled into each other's lives by accident, 2 unlikely neighbors, bound by early mornings and simple rituals, and in doing so, we had both found something neither of us knew we were missing. What happened every morning between us wasn't dramatic or wild. It wasn't a secret romance or a shocking scandal. It was conversation, kindness, listening, and presence. But sometimes, the simplest things leave the deepest mark. That morning, I realized this. Life doesn't always give us what we expect, but if we're paying attention, it gives us exactly what we need.